Karl Rove with us right now. Karl, good to see you. So you really come back to, despite, whatever your views on this and arguing that a president can't be taking documents out of the White House and all of that, down to the distraction it's getting to be for Republicans defending him or either commenting on it and not on inflation that's running out of control, the big economic pocketbook issues, right?
Yeah, exactly. Since the search on August 8th, what have we been talking about? We're now, just shy of a month of talking about this issue. And if you're a Democrat, you love it because Republicans are forced to talk about Trump taking classified documents to Mar-a-Lago instead of inflation, economy, the crisis at the border, or crime. So if you're a Democrat, you want them to be talking about this. If you're a Republican, you really want to be talking about these things. And so ironically enough, the decision for a special master, as you heard from both David Spunt in his excellent reporting and then that very smart guy named Andrew McCarthy, as you've heard, this is going to slow the whole process up. So, not a lot is going to happen in the next couple of months. There may be appeals and so forth, but in terms of new information, there's not going to be a lot. And Andy McCarthy said it was to the former president's advantage not to be talking about this issue. To Republicans, it's also an advantage not to be talking about this particular issue and instead talking about the things that people are talking about around the kitchen table, namely how do they keep up with the rising prices and how good is the economy going to be and what's going to be done about the border and the crime in their neighborhoods and communities.
Karl, I don't have to remind you what the former president has written about you for saying what you have on this issue, particularly the fact about you can't take government documents and bring them home. But does that bother you at a certain level, that what you're getting back to is this notion we've got to get off this obsession one way or the other and speak about the economy? I mean, you would think, and some people would say, well, maybe Karl's right about that, and that it's in the former president's interest as well, to make him less of an issue and more about the Republican Party's chances.
Yeah, look, and I understand the angst that he feels, how strongly he feels about this, but this is a situation that's largely of his own creation. He should not have taken those documents, but now that we're in this kerfluffle over what have they gotten back and how were they handled, it is better for him not to be talking about it. When he went to Pennsylvania this weekend, he spent over 80 minutes talking about this situation, and less than half that advancing the cause of the two candidates he was there to advance and the issues that will either determine whether they get elected or not. People are not going to vote Republican in order to affirm President Trump's view of what those documents were, namely his property. They will vote Republican if they have a conviction that Republicans are going to do something about the inflation that's consuming our country, do something about strengthening our economy without spending a lot more money, taking it from taxpayers and turning it over to the government, and if they do something about border security and crime. That's what they care about. And if we're going to motivate them to vote Republican in the fall, then Republican candidates need to have the airspace to talk about him, and the former president plays a big role in giving him that airspace.
But he's digging in deeper, right? He criticized Mitch McConnell again for supporting Alaska Senator Murkowski in her battle to keep her job. And you always think of the possibility, should Donald Trump run again and win, he's got to work with Mitch McConnell. How would that go?
Well, that's a long way off.
It
so
is.
Let's focus on the here and now. And you're right. Right now, it doesn't do any good for him to be critical of Mitch McConnell, and it doesn't do his party any good to spend most of his time talking about himself rather than talking about the issues that are consuming the country. He did a lot of good things when it came to the border and the economy and energy and so forth. He ought to build on that by focusing on those issues and talking about the next chapter.
So when you hear you're a rhino, I've heard worse, but Republican name only and all, on any level, does that bother you?
Not really. I mean, look, I don't need to prove to myself that I'm a true Republican. I don't need somebody else to hurt my feelings by saying I'm a rhino and having me feel sorry about myself. I've spent my adult life building and advancing the Republican Party. I was for George W. Bush in 2004, not John Kerry like some people were. I have been a loyal Republican, and I don't need anybody else to tell me that.
Karl Rove, very good seeing you. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.